Hello, I'm very glad to continue this conversation that we began, talking about the living gospel that is written in the lives of the saints and in our own lives. This morning I'm going to talk about Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic Worker. She once observed that the lives of the saints are often written as though they were not in this world. She continued, "We've seldom been given the saints as they really were." And yet she said, the saint is the holy person, the whole person, the integrated person. She added, we all want to be that. Now, Dorothy Day herself is in the process of being named an official saint of the Catholic Church. She's already been declared a servant of God, which is the first step along in that process. And Pope Francis, in his speech before the U.S. Congress in 2015, named her, along with Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., and Thomas Merton, as one of the four great Americans around whom he structured his remarks. Some people, I admit, have mixed feelings about the prospect of her being named a saint. Not because they feel that she is unworthy, but because they fear that the legalistic bureaucracy of saint-making is unworthy of her. After all, did she not say, "Don't call me a saint, I don't want to be dismissed so easily"? That has become one of the most widely quoted statements that Dorothy ever supposedly said. And did she actually say it? I hold some responsibility one way or the other, since, as far as I can tell, I was the first person to cite this in writing in the introduction to an anthology of her selected writings that I edited after her death in 1980. I'm quite certain she didn't mean to imply that she was cynical about the idea of sainthood or holiness. Dorothy was fantastically devoted to the saints. She constantly cited such figures as St. Francis, St. Teresa of Avila, or her favorite, St. Therese of Lisieux. She invoked their names in prayer. She frequently wrote that we are all called to be saints, though of course that didn't mean being canonized or having churches named after us. In fact, I owe my own lifetime of writing about saints to Dorothy Day, whom I met when I was 19. I went to the Catholic Worker in 1975, planning to take a year's leave from college. But soon after I arrived, Dorothy asked me to serve as managing editor of the Catholic Worker newspaper. At 20, I certainly had no evident qualifications for such a task. Probably her choice had more to do with the fact that she was desperate and no one else was particularly interested in the job. But Dorothy also had an uncanny ability to recognize people's hidden gifts and abilities, and to inspire them to do things they never would have dared to undertake. I had no idea at the time that she was pointing me in the direction of my life's work, not just as an editor, but as her editor. I remained at the Catholic Worker for 5 years, returning to college in 1980 after becoming a Catholic, and just months before her own death in November 1980 at the age of 83. Since then, I've edited 5 volumes of her writing and have been deeply involved in the promotion of efforts to have her named as an official saint. Now, some people worry that this will entail what she didn't want, to be put in a pedestal, to be presented as a perfect person, completely different from the rest of us ordinary folk. Thus, rather than inspiring us in our own pursuit of holiness, her example would tend to let us off the hook with the thought, well, Dorothy could do these things, live with the poor, go to jail for the cause of peace because she was a saint. I could never do that. In a similar spirit, people will say, I'm no Mother Teresa, to which the obvious retort was, well, Mother Teresa was not you. Others are concerned that naming Dorothy as a saint will involve watering down her radical prophetic message, her critique of the capitalist system, her resistance to the war-making state. She will be reduced to some kind of pious stereotype, not, as she would say, the saint as she really was. If I've supported this cause, it's because I believe that her inclusion in the list of official saints will have more effect in enlarging the church, of moving her radical message closer to the heart of the church, rather than diminishing her. Rather than making her smaller, it will make the church larger. So I think. In any case, if Dorothy is ever declared a saint, she'll be a saint with an unusual backstory, having renounced Christianity in her youth and spent her early years as a journalist and activist for radical causes. Among canonized saints, she would perhaps be unique for having been arrested for civil disobedience. The first time a 30-day stretch in Washington, D.C. for picketing in front of the White House on behalf of women's suffrage. Her friends were anarchists, communists, assorted literary bohemians. In the aftermath of an unhappy love affair, she had an abortion. This is hardly, I can tell you, the standard fare of Butler's Lives of the Saints. And yet there was always in Dorothy some yearning for the transcendent. Like a character in Dostoevsky, she observed, "All my life, I have been haunted by God." Yet even the circumstances of her conversion were unusual, in fact, I would say unique in the annals of the saints. Prompted by the experience of pregnancy out of wedlock and the birth of her daughter, this occurred while she was living in Staten Island with a man she deeply loved named Forster Batterham. After years of strife and unhappiness, this experience of love and what she called natural happiness turned her heart to the possibility of, quote, a greater happiness to be obtained from life than any I had ever known. She writes, "I began to think, to weigh things more, and it was at this time that I began consciously to pray more. It was also at this time that Dorothy discovered she was pregnant. This event had enormous significance for her. Following her earlier abortion, she'd believed she couldn't have children. Now she experienced such joy and an impulse of gratitude so large that it could only be directed to God. Before long, she found herself wishing to have her child baptized in the Catholic Church, a step she soon followed. As a dedicated anarchist, Forster would not be married by either church or state, and so to become a Catholic, Dorothy recognized, would mean separating from the man she loved. She wrote, "It got to the point where it was the simple question of whether I chose God or man. Ultimately, painfully, she chose God." In December 1927, she forced Forster to leave the house, and that month she was received into the church. What followed was a lonely time in the desert, which lasted for 5 years as she raised her daughter Tamar on her own, grew in the practice of her Catholic faith, and tried to figure out what she was supposed to do with her life. What was this all for? In becoming a Catholic, she felt that she was not just leaving the father of her child, but also the radical movement that had been such a part of her life. She believed the Catholic Church was the home of the poor, but it also seemed to be a bastion of support for the status quo. Nobody had ever taught her about the tradition of Catholic social teaching. The Great Depression was in full play. What message did the church have for the masses of unemployed and homeless people? In December 1932, she went as a journalist to Washington, D.C. to cover a March of the Unemployed, organized by some of her old communist friends. As she stood on the curb and watched this ragged procession of men marching to affirm their dignity and rights, she wondered why Catholics weren't leading the march. It was December 8th, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. She decided to go to the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception at Catholic University, where she lit a candle and she offered up a prayer, she says, with tears and much anguish, that some way would open up for her to use her talents to serve the cause of the poor and oppressed. And when she returned to New York, she found a strange Frenchman named Peter Morin waiting for her. He had come to persuade her to start a newspaper and a movement to promote the radical social message of the gospel. It took a while, it wasn't on their first meeting, before she realized that this stranger was the answer to her prayer. And that was the start of the Catholic worker movement, beginning with a newspaper she distributed on May 1st, 1933, at a communist rally in Union Square, and later the houses of hospitality that would become her home for the rest of her life. This year, as I'm recording this, will be the 90th anniversary of the Catholic worker. The story of Dorothy's subsequent life is probably familiar to some extent, how she went on for almost half a century to serve as the leader of this lay Catholic movement, living among the poor, practicing the works of mercy, feeding the hungry, sheltering the homeless, in the spirit of Christ's teaching that what we do for the poor, we do directly for Him. But she did not just practice charity. She combined this in her paper with a call for justice, a critique of the social system that gave rise to so much poverty and injustice, while holding out a constructive vision of an alternative society based on different values: mercy, solidarity, generosity, and self-sacrifice. She also served as a beacon of peace and nonviolence, standing against all wars, being repeatedly arrested for her protest against preparations for nuclear war, and standing in solidarity with all those who fought for justice and a new social order. And all this was rooted in her deep devotion to the gospel, to the spirit of the Beatitudes, to the sacraments, liturgical life of the church, the lives of the saints. This story is well known, but I want to offer some deeper reflections about what we can learn about conversion and vocation from the story of Dorothy Day. Much of this emerged for me many years after my time at the Catholic Worker, when I was invited to serve as the editor of her diaries and selected letters. In editing Dorothy's letters, All the Way to Heaven, I was struck by the contrast that marks the letters preceding her meeting with Peter Morin and those that follow 1 year later. Whereas before she was a single mother, a struggling freelance writer, trying to write stories and novels on the side, a young convert still finding her way in a church in which, she admits, I still did not know personally one Catholic layman. 1 year later, she's suddenly the confident editor of her own newspaper, the leader of a lay movement, a recognized name in both church circles and the social movements of the day. She's writing to bishops and editors and leaders of labor unions. And you think, where did this person come from? One often observes this in the annals of the saints, whether in the case of Teresa of Avila or Teresa of Calcutta. Once they discover their true vocation, their whole personality is transformed. They find a vitality and focus that had previously been lacking. As Dorothy herself once said, "You'll know your vocation by the joy it brings you." And it occurs to me that when Dorothy met Peter Morin, her heart was like dry kindling, to which he added the spark. His message would have meant nothing to her if she had not offered that prayer at the shrine of the Immaculate Conception, as she said, with tears and anguish, for some sign for her vocation. My experience of editing her letters also brought me back to look at that prayer in a new light. This came from reading the long sequence of love letters that Dorothy wrote to Forster for 5 years after their separation in 1927. While in her memoir she describes facing a choice between God and man and how she made her difficult choice for God, the letters make it clear that her story was not nearly as clear-cut as all that. For 5 years after her separation from Forster, she continued to write him, begging, cajoling, enticing him to give up his stubborn pride and agree to marry her. "Do I have to be condemned to celibacy all my days just because of your pig-headedness?" she writes to him at one point. The letters have an almost unbearable pathos. "The ache in my heart is intolerable at times, and sometimes for days I can feel your lips upon me, waking and sleeping. It's because I love you so much that I want you to marry me. I want to be in your arms every night as I used to be and be with you always." But in the end she realized this was not to be. On December 10th, 1932, she wrote what would be her final letter to Forster for many years. She spoke again of her deep love for him and her wish to marry, but in the end she acknowledged, "It's all hopeless. I've really given up now, so I won't try to persuade you anymore." Note that this followed by only 2 days her visit to the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception. And I think it obviously draws a new context for appreciating a prayer that came with tears and anguish that she might find her vocation. In letting go of Forster, and in that same week meeting Peter Morin, it was as if one door closed while another opened on the rest of her life. But another thought occurs to us when we realize how much her vocation depended on Forster's commitment to his principles. If it had been up to Dorothy, she would have married Forster, raised a house full of children, and continued writing novels and plays. In this alternative universe, perhaps she would have found happiness. but there would have been no Catholic worker. And you realize that everything she achieved in her subsequent life occurred because of the frustration of her heart's desire. Everything that would contribute to the church and to the world that caused Pope Francis to cite her as one of the great Americans and now fuels the cause of her canonization was built on an experience of hopelessness and surrender. And that sheds a different light on all the twists and turns in our lives, the follies, the sins, the failures, the mistakes, the things that broke our hearts, the doors that closed in our faces. And to imagine that somehow God was there all along, as much as in the moments of glory and discovery. One of the reasons Dorothy didn't like to be called a saint was that it made it seem as if what she had done came easily for her, things that would have been impossible for us. It did not give credit to the deep sacrifice she paid for her faith. But let's go back and reflect on the impulse that motivated that great leap. Many years later, at a Quaker retreat center in Pennsylvania, Dorothy happened to meet a great artist named Fritz Eichenberg, who was one of the great masters of wood engraving, a German immigrant, a Jew who became a Quaker. He was renowned for his illustrations of literary classics, such as novels of Dostoevsky and the Bronte sisters. Dorothy asked him if he would consider contributing some illustrations for the Catholic worker, and he went on to do this, providing iconic images that appeared for decades in the paper. But he also provided illustrations for Dorothy Day's memoir, The Long Loneliness. The choice of images was evidently left to him, and strikingly, he chose for the cover a depiction of the Annunciation, a gospel mystery that's not otherwise directly described in the book. In his piece, we see an already pregnant Mary, evidently asleep, while an angel hovering overhead is whispering into her ear. Meanwhile, in the background, a winding road is leading ahead to Calvary, where 3 crosses are already waiting. It's a sign of Eichenberg's artistic genius, I think, that he chose to link the crucial turning point in Day's memoir, her decision to respond with gratitude to the gift of her unexpected pregnancy, with Mary's consent to accept her role in a divine plan beyond her comprehension. Behold, the handmaiden of the Lord, may it be done unto me according to your will. The whole history of salvation is encompassed in Mary's surrender, and it is renewed and extended in every act of faith, no matter how great or small. As Dag Hammarskjöld, the Swedish diplomat and mystic, wrote, "I don't know who or what put the question. I don't know when it was put. I don't even remember answering. But at some moment I did answer yes to someone or something. And from that hour I was certain that existence is meaningful and that therefore my life in self-surrender had a goal." In the case of figures like Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton, Henri Nouwen, and so many others, their holiness did not lie in any particular action, but in the constant effort over a lifetime to answer yes, to follow where God was leading them. Their capacity for love, for friendship, their talents, their determination to be honest to God and to themselves about their faults, their impatience, their capacity for self-delusion, all were part of a lifelong process of ongoing conversion, an ongoing consent to the enormous question posed by someone or something. In talking about Dorothy's life, I've heard people describe her conversion as a deep break from her previous life as a radical. I've heard, for instance, the Archbishop of New York describe her as an Augustinian figure, saying that she was a great sinner who became a great saint. Everything she was previously for, he has said, she was now against, and everything she was against, now she was for. It's very hard to reconcile that picture with the story that she describes in her memoir, in which she gives credit to everything in her early life, her passions, her sufferings, her instinct for some transcendent truth, her love for the poor, her solidarity with all those working for a better world, and especially her experience of love. All of these things played a role in leading her to embrace faith early in her life. She writes of reading about the saints and admiring their care for the poor and sick, but a question arose for her. Where were the saints to try to change the social order? Not just to minister to the slaves, but to do away with slavery. That question was answered in her life. In that prayer in Washington, she prayed to find some way to reconcile her faith with her passion for the world, for justice, the cause of the oppressed. She longed, she said, to find a synthesis between body and soul, this world and the next. And she realized that that synthesis lies in the core doctrine of Christianity, the Incarnation, the belief that God fully entered into our humanity and our history, and what we did for others, especially the poor, we did for him. Others had taken inspiration from this to serve the poor through charity and the works of mercy. But Dorothy combined charity with justice. It was not enough just to bind up the wounds of the slave. She wanted to do away with slavery, with injustice, with racism, with war and violence. And in that sense, she invented a new model of holiness for our time. Nobody after Dorothy would have to ask, where are the saints, to try to change the social order? Still, in the purity of her vision and in her courageous witness, she continues to walk ahead, beckoning the church, including all of us, to follow. It falls on those who honor her memory to tell her story without softening any of its radical edges. At the end of the day, the fundamental significance of Dorothy's cause for sainthood is resting not just in her own example of holiness, but in the way she held up the vocation of holiness as the common calling of all Christians. She did not believe holiness was just for a few or for those dedicated to formal religious life. It was simply a matter of taking seriously the logic of our baptismal vows, to put off the old person and put on Christ, to grow constantly in our capacity for love. She lived out her own vocation in the Catholic worker movement. But she set an example for all Christians, especially lay people, reminding us that the gospel is meant to be lived and challenging us to find our own unique path of faithful discipleship. Dorothy was a great believer in what Jean-Pierre de Caussade called the sacrament of the present moment. In each situation, in each encounter, in each task before us, she believed, there's a path to God. We don't need to be in a monastery or a chapel. We don't need to become a different person first. We can start today, this moment, where we are, to add to the balance of love in the world, to add to the balance of peace. Thank you very much.